What kind of magazine could attract masters of horror literature, like A.P. Lovecraft, Merritt Robert E. Howard, and others, a best-selling publication that continuously serialized their works? Even in its centennial history, it pioneered many modern horror, mystery, and science fiction genres. It even pioneered the subculture of sadistic creation. And even the illustrations in its novels are considered collectible masterpieces even today. Undoubtedly, this is the star of this episode's extended compilation, detail, and influential name in the field. Tonight, DayFam will open this set of the famous 20th century weird and suspenseful magazine. Take you to experience the most authentic and original horror tales. Strange and beautiful fantasies, century-old selections vol. Old Mason is the keeper of one of the oldest and most easily overlooked cemeteries in Salem. He has a deep-seated grudge against the rats. These rats are so large that people are shocked when they hear of them. They arrived here through the docks several generations ago. They've been here ever since. They came here many generations ago, and ultimately chose to settle down in this graveyard. After the previous character mysteriously disappeared, Mason took over the job. He was determined to get rid of the rats. At first, he would set traps for them, or at the nests he found, he would leave out poisoned food. Later, he simply tried shooting them. But all efforts have been in vain. Rats continue to breed uncontrollably in this place. And over time, they greedily occupied every corner of the graveyard. They are unusually large. Mason has seen a few plump ones, nearly the size of wild cats. It happened once or twice. The grave diggers dug open their full-smelling caverns and were surprised to discover the tunnels were large enough to fit anyone. They crawled in on hands and knees. It was during the time when their ancestors were still alive that a cargo ship setting sail from a distant port arrived at decaying Salem dock, carrying these strange goods. Made sometimes be astonished by the vast scale of these caves. He would reminisce about how, since arriving in the ancient Salem, frequented by witches, he often heard those heart-pounding legends. Rumors spoke of a non-human creature that resided deep underground in those forgotten dark caverns. Long ago, Cotton Mather once hunted those so-called wicked heretics. Even though those days are long gone, but in the narrow, cobbled streets, the close-set houses still press their dark gables against each other, leaning and crooked. It is said that the secrets of blasphemy and the occult still linger. They are still hidden beneath this land, in cellars and caves. They lie quietly in wait. People gather here to perform ancient pagan rituals long forgotten. The elders sway their wisdom, while the heads of the white-haired women proclaim that beneath the ancient and unclean graveyard of Salem, there are things far more terrifying than maggots and rats. It's been secretly growing. When faced with rats, a strange sense of apprehension arises involuntarily. Mason doesn't exactly like these ferocious small predators, but he holds them in awe. Yet he couldn't understand the elderly, regarding those abandoned for many years. Places. The old house overrun with rats, held in inexplicable fear. He had vaguely heard whispers, hinting at something horrifying lurking deep beneath the earth. Those rats were under his control, an army at his beck and call. The rats were the connection between the real world and what lay beneath Salem, the messenger between those old, dark caves. The old people whispered it. They said bodies buried in the tombs would be stolen for a midnight feast held underground. But Mason scoffed at these stories. He didn't have a good relationship with his neighbors. In fact, the secret of the rodent infestation has always been deliberately concealed by him. None of the visitors were aware of it. He had long understood in his heart, investigating the rodent infestation would mean unearthing a large number of tombs, although some of the broken, empty coffins could be explained as the work of rats. Even so, it would still be hard for Mason to explain. Some fragmented remains were found in some of the coffins. The purest gold was often used to fill teeth. When a person is buried, this gold is usually not removed. Clothing, of course, is a different matter, because, usually, funeral homes provide an additional set of inexpensive, distinctive plain velvet suits. Dress the body. Gold always requires a special case. Occasionally, some medical students and disreputable doctors may also need a body, and they are indifferent to the source of the body. So far, Mason has successfully initiated an investigation into the unreported rat infestation, crushed in the cradle. Yes, He was secretly an unrepentant Tomb Raider. After carrying out those chilling thefts, Mason wouldn't care about what would happen to those bodies later, but the rat, yet they would precisely gnaw holes in the coffin, inevitably dragging the entire body away. There were a few times when Mason would be deeply concerned about the size of the holes the rats had gnawed. Additionally, there was another strange issue that he needed to worry about: the locations the rats had chewed through. They often focus on the bottom of the coffin, rather than the sides or the top, as if these rats are being driven by someone, carrying out this task under the command of an elusive, wise presence, to complete the job. Now, old Mason stands before an open grave, shoveling out the last scoop of wet soil. It landed on the pile of earth by the grave. For weeks, this drizzle falling from the damp, dark clouds had continued without ceasing, relentlessly creating a bleak and chilly atmosphere. In the graveyard, a swamp of muddy sediment had already formed. Everywhere, mud was being churned up, the remaining tombstones washed clean by the rain, crookedly in rows. Mason hadn't seen a rat for days. Those fellows had all retreated to their holes. But he was now stepping on a wooden coffin. His thin, bearded face was tightly furrowed. The body had been buried a few weeks ago, but Mason hesitated to act. Because even during the worst of times, a close relative of the deceased would still come to the grave without fail, regardless of the weather. But Mason was sure that she wouldn't visit this place on this deep night, no matter how intense her grief was. He let out a cold laugh. He straightened up and tossed the shovel aside. Standing in this ancient graveyard, in the pouring rain, he now needed light. So he pulled a flashlight from his pocket, then picked up the shovel again, and began to bend down to check the coffin's clasps. His body froze. At his own feet, he felt a distinct commotion and scraping. It seemed something inside the coffin was making a muffled sound. For a moment, Mason was gripped by superstitious terror. But when he realized what the sound meant, quickly replaced fear. Those damn rats had beaten him to it again. Mason was furious. He immediately ripped off the latch securing the coffin lid. Then he inserted the sharp edge of his shovel under the coffin lid. He began to pry it open forcefully, until with just his hands, he could lift the entire lid. After doing all this, he switched on his flashlight. A beam of cold white light shone into the coffin. The coffin was empty. Splashed inside, on the white silk lining, Mason vaguely some movement at the top of the coffin. So he adjusted the angle and shone the light in that direction. The end of the coffin had been gnawed through. A large dark hole had replaced the original spot. It was unclear where it extended to. Black shoe attached to a string was tied to the corpse's foot. Right under his very eyes, it was dragged away and disappeared. He immediately realized the rats had been only a few minutes faster than him. He quickly knelt down on the ground and hurriedly tried to grab the shoe. In his panic, the flashlight fell from his body and dropped into the coffin. With a click, it turned off. The black shoe he had gotten was once again dragged away. At the same time, he heard a sharp, excited scream. He had no choice but to pick up the flashlight again and shine the light into the cave. The tunnel space was extremely wide. Of course, this was obvious. Otherwise, the body could not have been dragged away so easily. Mason was initially shocked by the size of the rats that could drag the body away. But then he thought about the revolver in his pocket, full of loaded magazines. His last shred of hesitation vanished. If it were just an ordinary corpse, Mason wouldn't bother competing with the rats for their spoils. He wouldn't risk crawling into the narrow, cramped hole before him. He still clearly remembered the exquisite cufflinks he'd seen on the corpse, and the undeniably aristocratic tie pin, set with a real pearl. This undoubtedly made Mason agitated. He hesitated for almost no time at all. He quickly fastened the flashlight to his belt. Crouching down, he slowly crawled into the cave. The earthen walls around him seemed to press in on him from all sides. But he still managed to squeeze inside. In the light of the flashlight ahead, Mason could see a pair of shoes. They were being dragged forward in the damp soil at the bottom of the tunnel. He did his best to move as fast as he could, traversing the soil layers. But even then, his emaciated body was almost trapped several times on the narrow cave walls. The stench of rotting flesh fills the air in the tunnel. Mason had already decided that if he couldn't get the body within a minute, he would turn back. The late-arriving fear wriggled like maggots in his mind, growing and multiplying. But greed drove him to keep moving forward. During his journey, He passed more than once through intersecting tunnels. The tunnel walls were wet and sticky with mud. 2 clumps of mud fell behind him, immediately after he passed. After the second clump fell, he steadied himself and looked back. Of course, he couldn't see anything at all, until he took the flashlight from his waist, and then reversed it to shine behind him. Could he make out anything at all? On the ground behind him, many fallen chunks of earth lay quietly. His situation suddenly became extremely dangerous. Although he was now almost catching up to the body, with the invisible entity dragging the corpse ahead, but thinking that continuing might cause a collapse, he decided to abandon the mission. But he overlooked an obvious fact. The tunnel was too narrow. There was no way for him to turn back. Fear loomed over him. But after a moment, he recalled the passage he had just passed. This gave him the courage to move back along the passage until he returned to his previous position. Then he put his legs in. Awkwardly backing up, he finally turned around when he could. Despite his knees being scraped raw by the earth and the pain was unbearable, he still crawled outwards without stopping. Suddenly, a sharp, intense pain shot through his leg. He could feel sharp teeth sinking into his flesh. Panicked, he quickly brushed the thing off his leg. Then came a piercing scream, followed by a chaotic clatter of footsteps. Mason shone his light behind him, instantly holding his breath. A dozen or so enormous rats were crouched behind him, maliciously and intently staring at him. In the light, each rat's eyes gleamed coldly. They were so deformed and bizarre. Their size was close to that of wild cats. Behind them, Mason seemed to have seen a dark shadow. It quickly ran to a place he couldn't see. The fleeting figure was so enormous, it was almost unbelievable. Thinking of this, Mason trembled with fear. The sudden light slowed the rat's advance. But soon, they began to approach again. Mason struggled to pull his pistol from his pocket. Then he aimed carefully. His posture was awkward. He wanted to fight back. He had to be wary of which foot might get hit by a bullet. The deafening gunshots rang out, bang, bang. The gunpowder smoke made him cough uncontrollably. But after the brief loss of hearing, the smoke cleared. He realized the rats had already been scared off. He shoved the pistol back into his holster and continued crawling forward through the tunnel. But soon, they swarmed in again. Following right behind old Mason, the swarm of rats climbed up his legs. The sound of greedy biting and squealing was chaotic and maddening. Mason desperately tried to pull out his gun, while fearfully letting out a desperate scream. This time, he couldn't aim properly. He fired another shot. Fortunately, he didn't blow his own foot off. But this time, the rats didn't retreat too far. Mason could only crawl out with all his strength. He prepared to fire again as soon as he heard the next rat attack. He would fire once more. He continued to move forward. But after a moment, he stopped again. At the edge of the damp soil, there were some twisted, misshapen lumps. At first, he subconsciously thought that a clump of mud had fallen from above. But he quickly recognized what it was. It was the outline of a body. To Martin's surprise, it was a withered, shrunken corpse. What startled him even more was that the thing in front of him was actually moving. The corpse was crawling toward him. In the dim, faint light of the flashlight, saw its face. A grotesque gargoyle-like visage. The owner of this head has long since departed to the Yellow Springs. The remaining body is deathly still, yet returns to the mortal realm with the life of a hellish demon. Swollen, lifeless eyes, thick and gnarled like tree roots, mean the creature before him has been blind for a long time. As it crawled towards Mason, a faint groan reached Mason's ears. Its coarse, uneven lips curled slightly upwards. A faint smile appeared. Mason felt as if all the blood in his body had stopped flowing. But just before the terrifying creature lunged at him, twisted his body wildly, and dove into a nearby cave. The chaotic, noisy sounds of movement came from behind. The creature was still following him, making muffled, whining noises. Mason glanced. Screaming, he desperately twisted and turned in the narrow cave. His movements were weak and clumsy. Sharp stones cut his hands and knees, leaving them covered in blood. Mud and filth poured into his eyes like raindrops. But he didn't dare stop for a moment. The people are in charge. He was exhausted. He moved forward with difficulty. He struggled, gasping for breath. While cursing hysterically, he also muttered a few prayers. The rats, triumphant and aggressive, swarmed towards him. Their eyes were filled with terrifying hunger. Masson barely managed to repel them after they gnawed viciously at him. He fought them off only after they had bitten him. The passage ahead narrowed. In a frenzy of trembling, he thrashed his legs about, screaming hysterically. He only stopped firing his gun when the magazine was empty. By now he had driven all the rats away. And at that moment, he found directly above him a huge rock embedded in the earth. This rock was pressing hard against his back. When he struggled to move, the rock shifted slightly. Masson's mind was filled with panic. A thought flashed through his mind in a split second. Could he pry this massive rock loose and block off the tunnel behind him? The rain had thoroughly soaked the surroundings. He bent slightly at the waist, digging at the soil around the rocks. The rat swarm was returning, getting closer and closer. He saw the eyes of those creatures reflecting in the beam of his flashlight, becoming brilliantly shining. He dared not rest for a moment. The stones had begun to loosen under his digging. With a hard pull, the stones could be made to wobble on the foundation. Suddenly, a rat approached him. It was a rat with black fur all over, as large as a human. It has a fierce appearance, gray and filthy. It exposes a pair of sharp yellow fangs. The blind, nameless corpse follows closely behind, crawling and groaning. Mason pried the huge stone one last time. After clearly feeling the stone move downward, he continued crawling forward along the tunnel. After he left, the entire stone block fell down. A terrifying, agonizing scream immediately came from behind. Chunks fell onto his legs. He struggled with great effort to pull his foot out. Unexpectedly, the entire tunnel had collapsed as well. He suddenly lunged forward. Chunks of earth crumbled. They suddenly crashed down at his feet. He was so scared he could barely breathe. The entire tunnel was becoming narrower. Under the pressure of the collapse, he could barely move his legs. He couldn't use his hands to support himself and pull himself out. He could only move his body like an eel. Suddenly he felt a satin-like material being torn under his fingers. At the same time, his head collided with something, blocking his way. He shifted his legs and soon realized they have already been brought out of the collapsed mud, taken away from it. He is firmly pressed against the ground. When he tries to push himself up, he desperately realizes that the ceiling of the cave is only a few feet away from his back. When that blind, harmful thing, when his way forward was blocked, he desperately chose a side tunnel with no apparent way out. Now he had reached a coffin. It was an empty coffin. He crawled into the coffin through the side that had been broken by the rat's gnawing. He tried to turn his body around, but the coffin lid above him coldly pressed him down. He quickly realized that he couldn't do this. He immediately pulled himself together. He started to push the coffin lid with all his strength again, but he was completely unable to exert any force. The coffin lid remained motionless. Even if he somehow managed to escape from the coffin, how could he possibly break through the 5 feet of solid earth, climbing onto the ground? A terrible stench filled the air here. The humidity was unbearable. He felt his own breathing becoming rapid. In a helpless panic, he frantically tore at the coffin lining until he had ripped it to shreds. He futilely tried to use his feet to block his retreat. The collapsing earth, if only he could turn himself upside down, perhaps he'd have a chance to breathe fresh air. Burning pain flooded his chest. It soon made his eyes bulge. His head seemed to swell a whole circle, and it continued to swell. Suddenly, the shrill cries of a dense mass of rats began to rise and fall. He began to yell frantically, but he was completely unable to suppress the rats' commotion. In this cramped prison, he shouted hoarsely for a while, but soon he was too weak to continue. He stopped breathing heavily. His eyes slowly closed. His purple, swollen, and blackened tongue also slipped out, amidst the crazed, sinister laughter of the rat swarm ringing in his ears. He gradually sank into the black curtain of death. Nurture. Nurture. The story of the rat in the grave comes to an end here. To fan who had already watched Guillermo del Toro's fantastic imagination, the film adaptation published by Turner, after rereading the original work, I was actually even more amazed by the original's meticulous descriptions and felt a greater sense of wonder. It's as if the author, Henry Kuttner, really lived in this bizarre and curious world. But the strangeness of Weird Tales doesn't end there. The next story will surprise you even more. That person tried desperately to sell this house to me. He was convinced I would fall in love with it. He kept emphasizing that I should pay attention to the view outside. As for the view, what he said did make some sense. From this villa perched on the mountaintop, I can take in the entire beautiful valley below. The view here is truly stunning, the real estate agent repeated himself, saying that regardless of the year or season, the view from this spot is worth at least double the price I offered. But I don't need to pay to see this view, I retorted. That's debatable, unless you want to trespass. But this place is very rundown. There's even no running water. You're wrong. At that moment, he flashed a brilliant smile, revealing his mouth full of gold teeth. He smiled widely. You hear, we're not talking anymore. Then we suddenly heard the sound of water churning. I turned around. I followed the sound. Discovered a marble Cupid statue, spitting water in a strange way, into a wall-mounted trough. I commented with a laugh. They have similar contraptions in Brussels and Madrid. It's quite fun, huh? This is pretty funny, but I want the running water of a modern bathroom. While you can sit here comfortably and enjoy the view, why would you specifically need a modern bathroom to take a bath at an inconvenient time? Right, sir? It seems I won't be getting any favors from him. So I wrote a check. I got his documents. From this moment on, I officially became the owner of this mountain and a stone house perched on the summit, which seems to be abandoned. But he doesn't know one thing yet, and I naturally won't tell him. Actually, I rushed all the way to Italy. It's specifically to get this Cupid fountain. I plan to buy it and ship it back to the United States. I know everything about this unusual marble sculpture. I am thoroughly familiar with it. My dear friend George Seabrook once left me a letter about this fountain. But that's the only one. Then he disappeared without a trace. Heaven knows where he's run off to. George is always like this. He's an athlete. He's always rushing around to different competitions, so he's constantly on the go. Now I finally have this fountain. I've already started thinking about where I'm going to put it in my New York home. I sit on the marble bench, gazing at the fountain. My peripheral vision falls, the valley in front of me at noon. The real estate agent wasn't wrong. What unfolds before me is undoubtedly a delicate and beautiful view. Stretched lazily. I glanced at the car next to me. Then I returned to the house. Two farmers were sitting in the kitchen, an old man and old woman. As soon as I entered, they both stood up. Who are you? I asked in English, but they just smiled and waved at me. I quickly started speaking Italian again, repeating my question. We work here. Who do you work for? Who is the master here? We serve whoever that is. What do you mean? This sentence confuses me a bit. Have you all been here for a long time? We've always lived here. This is our home. His words made me laugh. I asked, do you mean? The owners here have changed over and over again, but you all are the only ones who stayed. It seems like that's the case, sir. Could it be that there are really many other masters?
Yes, that's right.
They come and go, coming back and leaving again. There have been quite a few. They were all nice young people like you. But they wouldn't stay here. They bought it and enjoyed the view. They had dinner with us a few times, then left after just a few days. And then the villa was flipped. The person shrugged and said, how would we know? We read just the workers here. All right, looks like I won't get anything out of them. Then prepare dinner for me. Bring it outside when it's ready. Just put it under the grapevine. That way I can admire the distant scenery there. The woman took the order and went to cook. The man took a step closer. Shall I take your luggage to the bedroom, sir? Yes, I'd like to go with you to unpack. He led me to a room on the second floor. There was a bed and an extremely old dresser. Besides that, the floor and the rest of the room were spotless. The walls had just been repainted. The smooth white surface concealed paintings and poetry, or other possible eccentric ideas, as well as the writings and copied texts from my past masters, who poured out their ink and words in despair. Have all the past owners of the house slept here? The old man answered yes. They all have slept here. I immediately asked if there was someone named George Seabrook. I think there might have been, but they come and go. I'm already very old. I can't remember clearly. His answer seemed less unclear, and more like he was hiding something. So I didn't give up, but kept asking. You say you're sure there will always be new masters taking over? Is that so? Of course, someone has to pay us our wages, right? I seriously placed a gold coin into his hand, which he could barely hold onto anymore. Then I asked where they went after that. Were they doing business, going home, or something else? He looked at me with his aging eyes and slowly began to speak. I don't know, I'm not sure. Anyway, the gentleman didn't stay long before leaving. It was clear that this old man wouldn't reveal anything more. But my mind couldn't help but speculate. Fixed servants, a fixed villa. Yet always welcoming wave after wave of owners. They come here and buy the house. They wrote and drew uniformly on the wall, then they just left. My friend, who works as a real estate agent, would then pass the house on to the next person. This really is a good way to make a living. Long after lunch, the time had come for a sleepy and drowsy afternoon. The sky gradually changed color. It's about to rain. An old man hurried over and showed me a place to park. It was a recessed area next to the house wall, one side completely exposed, but it offered some shelter from the wind and rain. The stone floor was stained black with oil. Clearly, more than one vehicle had been parked there before. Other cars have waited here too. Noticing this, all the owners drive here, the old man replied. After returning to the stone veranda, I quietly waited for the storm to arrive. The maid inside was lighting candles. I took one from her hand, saying I wanted to wander around the house. She didn't say much, so I started exploring from the first floor. Some of the rooms on the first floor were clearly for servants, and one was the kitchen. The remaining 2 rooms in times past might have been used as a dining room or a living room. There was almost no furniture here. The walls were also covered in mildew from the passage of time. Everything became dark, so I decided to go down to the basement to take a look. Actually, the so-called basement was actually a cubic pit on the mountaintop. Everything looked very old. It gave me an uneasy feeling. Unconsciously, I felt that this basement was a tomb in the past. It felt like a house had been built on top of it later, but after going deeper down, there was no evidence to support that feeling. In the corner of the basement, there were a few wine barrels. Otherwise, it was empty, dusty. A strange room indeed, told myself, because in a way, it seemed incongruous with the villa built on top of it, neither in shape nor size. It wasn't harmonious. I thought there would be more larger and gloomier things here. So I started wandering around. I started inspecting the walls. Then something caught my attention. 3 walls of the room were carved from stone, but the remaining wall was made of brick. There was also a door on it. This door leads to another room. Or could it serve another purpose? Since there's a door here, it just means there must be a lot of things hidden on the other side, because the door is covered with iron hinges, a huge padlock. This is honestly the biggest padlock I've ever seen. Of course, I want to open this door. And as the owner of the villa, I have every right to do so. But when I started giving orders to the old man, when I expressed my intentions, he shook his head. He said he had never had a key to that door. Indeed, the old man knew of the door's existence, but he had never been on the other side. The door has a long history. Perhaps his ancestors knew something about what lay beyond that door, but they are all gone now. He completely exhausted me, to the point where I had to rest my hand on the end of the hinge. I knew his gesticulating was actually a lie. He's lived here his whole life. How could he not have seen the moment the door opened? I asked again, whose hands are the keys in? Answer me honestly. He still had that same smirk on his face. He said, the owner of the house, of course. Made me furious. Aren't I the owner of the house? I've already bought this house. Yes, you are the owner here. But what I mean is, the owner of this house all along. The one who possesses it. Bit confused. So you're saying the previous owners didn't truly own the house? They bought it, but they all left, right? But the owner you mentioned has always owned this house and has been constantly trying to sell it. He gave me a definite answer. It's quite a lucrative business, isn't it? Who is this owner? I asked without a second thought, and his answer was a very familiar name. It was also the friend who initially recommended this apartment to me. Donna Marquez. I think I saw her in Sorrento yesterday. Does she live there? The old man nodded. He said yes, she lives over there. So as soon as the storm had just passed, I told the old man I would return before dinner. I went to the bedroom to change clothes. Because Salona is just 2 miles behind the mountain, I plan to visit her this afternoon. Miss Dunna that is. I must say I'm lucky. She happens to be home today. I might have crossed paths with her before. But not at this moment. It was then that I truly felt her unprecedented beauty. At least, that's how it seemed at first glance. She was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, especially her eyes were incredibly captivating. Her pupils were more slender and narrow, rather than round and wide. She had long fingernails, unevenly dyed a dark red, matching her Titian-colored hair perfectly. She seemed surprised I would come to visit. After she learned the purpose of my visit, she was even more surprised. "You really bought the villa?" she asked. "Yes, didn't you recommend it?" "Excuse me, miss, but when I bought it, I didn't know you were the owner." The agent never told me who he was working for, she said, smiling. "Franco is very particular in this respect. He always pretends the house is his." Without a doubt, he's probably used this trick more than once. She was adding tea for me while telling me, "Do you know why I don't live there myself? That place seems to be filled with an ominous atmosphere. After I drafted the retention clause and then sold it off, the owners of the property would stay there for a day or two, then it seems no one was willing to stay. So after going in circles, the house ended up back in my hands." I suppressed the question in my heart and replied, "Sounds like a place with a long history. Many people must have lived there. It's very old. It's been in our family. It's been passed down for centuries. I've tried to get rid of it, but the young people don't want to stay. What can I do?" She shrugged meaningfully. I countered, "Perhaps if they knew like I do, that you are the steward of this land, maybe she would be content staying in Salona." She replied with smooth words. The room fell silent immediately. I could hear her heavy breathing. It was like a cat purring. "They always come and go," she said after a moment. "So after they leave, would you sell it to someone else?" I asked again. "Of course, actually I hoped someone would stay." Hearing this, I didn't beat around the bush anymore. I directly said I was willing to stay. "But I have a condition. I want to come and get the key to the basement door." She wasn't even surprised. She just asked, Are you sure you want this?" "Of course, it's my villa. My basement." I was ready to get the key. Then I'd see what lies on the other side of the door. No, the words were barely out. I saw her pupil suddenly contract into narrow slits. She stared at me for a second, 5 seconds. Then she opened a drawer next to her chair, pulled out a key, and handed it to me. It was a truly heavy, thick thing. It was 8 inches long, a pound in weight, and perfectly matched the door it was meant to open. Took the key, thanked her, and left. But 15 minutes after saying goodbye, I returned, hurriedly saying hello. I explained to her that I had a volatile temper, the tendency to frequently change one's mind. Then I told her, no matter what is left on the other side of the door by her family, it can stay there. It doesn't matter to me. After returning the key to her, I kissed her hand again, leaving here. In fact, this is just a play of mine. A person from such an arrogant and wealthy family might never notice the vendors coming and going downstairs. One of them is a locksmith. When I was pretending to return her key, the locksmith had already begun to work. The wax seal left by the original key earlier. An hour later, I had already returned to the villa, and I had that key in my pocket. Key that I was sure could absolutely open that door. I believe the lady with the cat's eye must have thought that I had lost all interest in that door and whatever was behind it. The car had just driven into the villa's parking area. The full moon rose from the mountaintop. I lifted the candlestick the old woman gave me and walked up the stairs into the bedroom. I quickly fell into a deep sleep. Woke up suddenly. The moon was still emitting a soft glow. It was now midnight. I heard, or I thought I heard, a groan. Then it vanished, replaced by deeply solemn musical phrase. These sounds rippled through the air in the room, yet seemed to come from a great distance. I strained my hearing to the utmost. Only then could I faintly sense a hint of rhythm. I grabbed the flashlight and put the key into the pocket of my pajamas. I slowly walked down the stairs. Sounds came from the servants' room. This seemed to prove that they had already fallen asleep. Quite deeply. Then, who else could be making this sound? I came to the basement. I inserted the key into the keyhole. The key turned easily. This means there's no rust inside. Whether it's the spring or the rollers, everything is like new, oiled. It's clear someone has been through this door recently. And just as I was about to open the door, a woman's voice suddenly reached my ears. She was singing in Italian, and it seemed to be a passage from an opera. Then came a burst of applause. Next were repeated unbearable groans, followed by a scream. It seemed someone was hurt. No doubt, these were the sounds I heard in the bedroom. Now I know where those sounds are coming from. All the sounds are coming from behind this door. There's a huge mystery, waiting for me to solve it. But I'm sure, at this moment, I'm not ready to take this step. So I have to turn the key back. I locked the door. Then I quickly got back into bed. I admit I was scared. But my mind couldn't stop speculating. This house had so many owners. One after another they bought this house, only to disappear afterward. Every time they leave, the walls are repainted. What secrets lie behind this layer of white paint? What is hidden behind the door? Standing in the basement. What is its connection to all these activities? Why do the servants pretend to know nothing? What is really behind that door? There is no ready answer to tell me, but I'm sure there is one person who knows. Donna Marcosi. Is that her voice I hear? She almost understands all of this. I believe it, but there is one thing I know. And she doesn't, which is that I can pass through this door. Let's see what's on the other side of the door. The next day, I pretended to be unwell and confined myself to my room, dozing. I spent the whole day doing nothing, until near midnight, ventured downstairs. Unsurprisingly, the servants are still sound asleep. Of course, that's not without reason. It's thanks to the sleeping pills I added to their drinks. I made sure to bring the key, and I left a handgun in my pocket. I walked down to the basement to open the door. The greased hinges moved silently with my motion, slightly creaking with a faint arc. After the gate opened, a wave rushed from the other side. First, it was a darkness comparable to hell, and then an indescribable stench hit me. It was a mix of blood and sweat. It smelled of rotting food, and also of some kind of viscous bodily fluid. I swept the light around. This is not a room, but a cave. It stretches endlessly into the distance. The ceiling here is supported by stone pillars. At regular intervals, there are pillars that run from top to bottom, and beams of light shine through, illuminating far, far away. Wherever the eye could reach, there were thick white columns everywhere. On each column, there was a person bound. They were all tightly chained in place. They remained still on the stone ground. About 20 of them had already fallen asleep. Their snoring grunts and groans echoed around them. But not a single person opens their eyelids. Even when the light in my hand sweeps across their faces, their eyes remain tightly shut. These faces are all repulsive. Each of their faces is pale and haggard, etched with deep pain. Everyone's clothes are torn and tattered. Especially on the lower half, there was almost no intact cloth left. Their bodies were covered in wounds. Each one was long, thin, and deep. Some were bright red. Others were old and scabbed over, surrounded by a deathly white pallor. Finally, they were uniformly sunken-eyed, and the reaction of not being able to see my flashlight undoubtedly revealed to me a nauseating truth. The people here are all blind. Or rather, they have all become blind. I felt a chill run down my spine, because I thought of a blind person who is destined to forever gaze into darkness, being bound by a stone pillar, unable to move. This is already bad enough, but situation ahead is countless times worse than this suffering. Then another thought suddenly crossed my mind, a terrifying thought that I couldn't suppress. These people, could they be the former owners of the legendary villa? Did they come here, buy that, then leave immediately? They didn't go to work. Instead, they were confined in the basement of the house. Donna Marchetti, I muttered to myself. What are you thinking behind that peephole of yours? If you're involved in this, then you're not human. You are an evil tiger. I think I may have grasped a fragment of the truth. Every owner of the house comes to her for the key to the basement. Then after stepping through that door, they can never leave. But tonight, she and her servants weren't prepared to greet me on the other side of the door. Because she didn't know I had the key. It was really a close call. I suddenly thought, maybe one of these people, someone who's fast asleep, is George Seabrook. Past. He would often ask me to play tennis. Our relationship was as close as brothers. On the back of his right hand was a large wound. It was a bluish, star-shaped scar. Thinking of this, I began to carefully walk between them, passing by one sleeping person to the next and checking their right hands in turn. Finally, I found a wound on someone's right hand that resembled the scar from my memory in an unusual way. But the owner of this hand, that blind man, was nothing but a skin and bones guy, looking like a skeleton, his body tightly bound to the stone. It's impossible. This guy can't be my best friend, George. That cheerful, sunny young tennis player. This discovery is making me sick to my stomach. How can I explain this? What does it all mean? If all this was orchestrated by Donna Marquisi, what were her motives? Down into the cavernous chamber, the road beneath my feet seemed endless. Without end, many pillars held only empty chains. But no one was in sight. Randomly, from the tunnel in front of me, I heard a sound. A song drifting from afar. I quickly ran back towards the gate. As much as possible, I shrank myself into a dark corner. Hiding behind a distant rock, I concealed myself in the darkness, holding a flashlight and the grip of a revolver. In the silence, I held my breath. The singing grew louder. And then the singer came into my view. It's no one else. It's Donna. She's dressed in extremely revealing clothing, holding a lantern in one hand. She steps over each of the sleeping people in turn. Every movement of hers is exactly the same. First, she kicks each of these men in the face to wake them up. Then, after they sit up and begin to suffer, a piece of hard bread is thrown into their trembling, outstretched, and helpless hands. This is all they have to eat. Aside from the sound of their teeth breaking through the tough crust of the bread, is silence. These poor prisoners are already starving, on the verge of death from hunger. After the bread was in hand, she hurriedly devoured it. When they cried, wanting more, she smiled, fully satisfied, a smile filled with lust. Under the light, the vengeful spirit began to mock the prisoner in front of her. I swear, saw her yellow eyes suddenly widen in the dim light. Then she barked, "Get up, you bunch of dogs." They rose like a pack of well-trained animals. They awkwardly rose to their feet, but trembling limbs and heavy chains hindered their movements. Even their fastest movements were somewhat slow. Two of them were too slow to obey. She randomly picked up a whip and struck their faces. She wouldn't stop until she heard their painful whimpers. After standing up, they remained silent in place. More than 20 blind people, each one was locked to the pillar behind them. Then the woman began singing among them. She clearly had vocal training, but her voice had a slightly jarring tone. Her high note sounded like a wild animal's cry. There was no sweetness to it, as she sang. The so-called audience around her waited quietly. Finally, when she finished, they all started clapping. Their shrunken hands collided. She seemed to begin assessing how these people appreciated the performance just now. Among them, clearly one person's performance hadn't met her standards. She strove her and raked her long, pointed nails across his face, until his face was swollen. Blood also oozed from his fingertips. When she finished singing the second song, the man clapped more vigorously than anyone else. Looks like he's learned his lesson. This time, it was as if she specifically rewarded this loyal listener by yanking off the last shred of cloth from his waist, or rather his last form of modesty. She began to caress the man, from time to time as she dug her sharp nails into his flesh. Then in this filthy environment, they engaged in a profoundly degrading act of intercourse. In the end, she gave each of them a piece of bread and a spoonful of water. She picked up the lantern and basket and left. Her figure disappeared into the tunnel in the distance. This group of blind people cried out angrily and cursed behind me. Then they collapsed helplessly onto the stone pillars. At that moment, I went to find my friend. I took his hand and said, George. George Sibrook. I whispered his name. He sat up and shouted, Who's calling me? Whoever sees this really is him. I told him everything in detail. He started crying. Finally, he calmed down. He was able to talk to me. What he said next was a little different from what I expected. It happened in the stories of everyone here, and of those who have been here, but are no longer with us. Everyone here has been the master of this villa for a day or a week. Everyone found the door to the basement and went to Donna Marchetti to ask for the key. Some people have doubts during this process. They wrote their thoughts on the bedroom wall. But in the end, no one could resist this curiosity. One by one, they opened the door. On the other side of the door, they were restrained. Then they were chained to the pillar. They will stay here from now on until they die. Among this group of people, some may last longer than others. Take Smith from Boston, for example. He has been here for over 2 years. Although he is coughing badly now, he feels his end is near. But clearly his vitality is still very strong. I waited for George to finish telling their story. Then I whispered, Are your eyes permanently damaged? Yes. On the first night we came here, it happened like this. She used her nails. She literally gouged our eyes out. Does she come every night? Every night. She comes over every night. She feeds us. She sings to us. We clap along. Then she forces us to satisfy her desires. If anyone of dies, she will take the body down from the pillar. Then he'd throw her into some hole. Sometimes he'd talk to us about that hole and brag, saying he'd one day fill it with bodies. But who was helping him? I think it was the real estate agent, that Franco fellow. And of course, those 2 old geezers upstairs were certainly helping too. I think they must have drugged me when I wasn't looking. They drugged me. And some people say that they were sleeping soundly in bed and woke up chained to a post. Then I bent down and whispered in his ear, George, if she comes over to sing, you realize you haven't locked it. What would you do? What if neither you nor anyone else has locked it? What would you do, George? Go ask them. He screams madly. You go ask them one by one. I know what I would do. I know. But then he started crying, because the next moment, he gave up. He was filled with anger but powerless, until tears flowed from his empty eye sockets. I calmed him down again. I asked if she always comes at the same time.
As far as I know, yes.
But time no longer matters to us. We're just quietly waiting to die here. Are the chains fastened tightly? Yes, and she must have the key. But if we had a file, we should be able to saw through these chains. If each of us had a file, we'd surely be free. Perhaps the person upstairs has the key, but I don't think it's very likely. It seems I've already gotten the answer I wanted. I said, George, I'll ask you again. When she sings for you, are you sure you know what to do? He paused for a second. Clearly, he understood what I meant. Answered yes. We all knew. So I left. I promised that as long as I prepared a bit, I would take care of this matter very soon. The next day, I visited Donna Marquis again. This time I brought her a bouquet of flowers, a bunch of vibrant purple and scarlet orchids. She entertained me in her own music room. Taking advantage of this cue, I invited her to sing. She became shy, almost reluctantly complying with my request. She sang an opera selection I knew only too well. At the enthusiastically started clapping. She smiled. Do you like hearing me sing? Of course. I'd even like to hear you sing again. If I could hear you sing every day, I might never feel tired in my entire life. You're so kind, as she muttered. Maybe we can arrange that. Arrange it? You're really too modest. Your voice is so beautiful. Why not share it with the world? Maybe you could perform on a stage or something. She sighed and said, sung in public once. It was at a private concert in New York. There were a lot of men there. Maybe it was because I got stage fright. The sound I make is unpleasant. Those spectators, they aren't very kind to me. They don't even move. It's like being tied to a pole. Staring blankly, I'm not quite sure. But I can definitely feel that some of them are dissatisfied with me. I hope. I replied, suppressing my anger. Your voice is so beautiful. When I applauded you, was absolutely sincere. By the way, changed my mind. May I ask you for the key to the basement door? Do you want it? Do you really want to take it? My friend, this time I'm sure. I'm going to take it. I might never use it. But just having it in my hands makes me happy. It makes me feel more at ease. In life, these little things can bring a smile to one's face. Just like your singing, just like your key. She smiled again and said, well, you can take it with you. By the way, could you do me a favor? When Sunday comes, use it then. It's Friday today. You won't have to wait long. I happily replied. Of course, I would be glad to do as you asked. Then, I kissed her hand. Can I hear you sing again? Can I come often to listen to you sing in the future? Yeah, sure. She sighed softly. I believe you'll often hear me sing in the future. I feel that our destinies are to some extent heading in the same direction. I looked into her eyes, yellow cat eyes, certain that he was telling the truth. After saying goodbye, I first went and bought 24 rat tail files. Then I hurried over mountains and valleys, straight to Milan. There I secretly met with the consuls of my own country, Britain and France. Little, they didn't believe the story I brought, but after I gave them the name George that he had given me, they had to admit they had heard a little about these disappearances. It was just that my description of the dungeon was so exaggerated that in the end, they even brought in the head of the investigation bureau. We will go there on Saturday night, he assured me. You should go back on your own tonight. That woman will come to tempt you on Sunday, right as you said. Can you keep an eye on those 2 old servants? They won't jeopardize the plan, I told him. You all need to be careful. Don't let Franco seize the opportunity to escape. Also, this is the extra key to that door. I'll get in before 12 o'clock. Once I'm ready, I'll open the door. Then, if it's 1 o'clock in the morning, I haven't come out of the door yet, or maybe you heard a huge noise of chaos. Then you should go in with the police. Do you understand what to do? The American consul replied. I understand, but I still think maybe you've had too much to drink. I smiled. I left them behind. After returning to the villa, I drugged the 2 old servants again. Though the dosage was too large, it was enough to ensure they sleep well tonight. After all, I'm not stingy with my gold. I had inadvertently revealed to them the exact location where I kept my gold. I know that every day my fortune is shrinking, but it's enough to confuse them both. Make them think I'm a fool, completely letting their guard down. Then I slip inside the door. Once again, I hear Dona Marquez singing to her audience. And this audience never dares to boo. After she leaves, I started handing out files to everyone, from one blind man to another. I spoke softly to them, offering words of encouragement, preparing for the next evening. They would use the files to saw through a link in their chains, but they had to do it in a way that wouldn't arouse suspicion from the tiger cat, so it wouldn't realize they had freed themselves. Soon Sunday night arrived. I gave double the tip to the 2 elderly people. They were so moved that tears filled their eyes. They tried their best to thank me. They called me their dear master. It was like soothing a baby. I gently put them to sleep. In reality, I truly wanted to know, will they be able to wake up from this dose I gave them? Wake up. I didn't even bother tying them up. I just threw them onto the bed. At 30, the car arrived as scheduled. After arriving at the villa, San deliberately dimmed the headlights a bit. We gathered together and held a long meeting. It was just after 11 o'clock. I quickly slipped inside the door. I didn't dare to waste any time. I made sure that every blindfolded prisoner was now free. But I insisted they still acted as if they were restrained, within the right time frame. They were trembling all over, but this time it was definitely not out of fear, but because of the excitement of imminent rebirth. I quietly hid in my hiding place and began to wait for things to unfold. Singing reached my ears. 10 minutes later, I saw the Marquise, her fingers hooking a lantern, gradually appearing in the tunnel. I must admit, she was more beautiful that night than I had ever seen her before. She wore a delicate white gown, which softly outlined her slender figure. Her lovely hair, her long graceful limbs, could bind any man for eternity. By her side, she too seemed lost in the enchantment of her own beauty. After distributing the first batch of moldy bread, she changed her act. She started telling the audience around her that she had dressed up tonight to make them happy. She also described the expensive jewelry and clothing she was wearing. When mentioning her beauty, she almost became even more extravagant. She reminded the man in front of her that he would never see her face, never kiss her. All they can do is listen to music here, clap and die in the end. Donna didn't know, when saying these boastful words to these blind people, she was so close to danger. Fortunately, those men still kept their composure. No one chose to make a move just yet. Then she began to sing. I carefully observed her expression, confirmed my suspicions. She sang with her eyes closed the whole time. Was she fantasizing that she was at some private concert, opera house, facing thousands of admirers who adored her? Who knows, but that night, when she started singing, her eyes never opened. Not even until the end of the song. As she waited for the applause to come, her eyes remained tightly closed. The song ended. All was silent. The expected applause didn't come. He instantly flew into a rage. He turned and went to the basket, preparing to pull out the whip. That she cried. Have you forgotten your lesson so quickly? She realized. The more than 20 blind people were closing in on her. They were silent. No shouting, but the hands reaching out from the dark crowd were all trying to grab whatever they were looking for. Even when she swung the whip in her hand, they made no unnecessary sound. Then a man touched her. But her fearless demeanor was clearly admirable. She knew exactly what had happened. She must have understood her predicament, but she wasn't afraid. Just scream now, was merely the tiger cat's battle cry. Before charging into battle, she only let out this one cry. The group of men silently crowded around her. They reached out to grasp the dreams in their hearts. For a time, they stood together. But soon, they collapsed and fell to the ground. Pile of bodies formed. Under this writhing heap of people, it's an animal struggling fiercely, biting, scratching. It's already dying. As planned, I should immediately notify the people upstairs, who are waiting for their chance. But when I heard Donna surrounded by that group of people, she wasn't screaming, but instead moaning in extreme pleasure. I have firmly stood my ground. Actually, deep in my heart, I had already made my plans long ago. I was looking forward to this moment. I have completely made up my mind. I've chosen to silently watch. Just watch. Finally, the sound of hurried footsteps on the stairs broke my reverie. The police used a spare key to open the door and burst in. Only then did I come to my senses. I falsely shouted, quick, quick, someone. Get the blind man out of there. Arrest that woman. Over the next 10 minutes, they were brought to the kitchen one by one. Identity confirmation began. Some people's faces had been mutilated beyond recognition. There were deep, long claw marks on them. Some even had chunks of flesh bitten off. One person had lost their entire upper lip. It looked as if someone had bitten it off. Among these people who were rescued, most of them started sobbing hysterically. Although no one dared to say it, in a way, I think they must be happy at this moment. I feel like they are happy right now. Back to the basement. We passed through that door. We were on the floor. I saw a red and white lump. What is this? The American consul asked. Can't you tell, sir? This is Donna Marchetti. I answered. A smile involuntarily appeared at the corner of my mouth. Room. Her performance, nearly 100 years ago, was clearly, between the hands of horror writers of their time began to show such perverse subcultural works. So in the combination of some culture and ghost stories, David Henry Keller can be considered a pioneering figure. If the previous two pieces brought a sense of despair trapped in a confined space, detail, Defan will bring you your detail, the unknown fear from the vast ocean. I am currently aboard a fully loaded troop transport ship, sailing westward in the heart of the Pacific Ocean. A few hours ago, the sun had already set in the west. Pitch black darkness quickly followed. Since we left the coast of California behind, more than a week has passed. Our goal is the endless, wild blue ocean. Nothing but ourselves. We see nothing else. Because our captain boldly chose it between the two commonly used shipping lanes. Therefore, these past few days, we haven't seen a single other ship, let alone a lighthouse from any land. We know full well that besides the dark sea spreading beneath our feet, even the nearest land is over 1,000 miles away beyond the southern horizon. on this boundless ocean. We are just an insignificant cargo ship, yet we carry the most precious souls. Sailing against the wind within. I don't know much about ocean voyages. But if what those old salts and veterans on board say is true, then this voyage will be as safe and uneventful as the others. But sometimes in a flash, all of us will feel a sense of unease again. We no longer believe their empty promises. It seems like something has been warning me from the very beginning. This journey of ours is a matter of life and death. But I can't bring myself to speak it out. To be exact, this feeling is hard to describe as fear. Is it anxiety? It is more of a subtle, indescribable and strange sense of unease. When I stood on the deck with these soldiers, the massive ship gently swayed beneath our feet. Until they mastered the skill of not getting seasick, they remained in a strange, vague state of disorientation. The origin of it all seemed to vaguely point to the night shift change that evening. The officer who was supposed to be on duty that night suddenly fell ill. I was ordered to take his place. We had 7 sentries posted at various key points on the ship. 7 sentries, less than an hour before midnight. I made my final rounds before going to sleep. When I returned to my private room and turned on the light, an uneasy feeling was stronger than ever before. My gut told me that even though I had locked the door, when I left the room last time, someone had still dared to act while I was away. They committed the crime in defiance of the risk it slipped in. But how could that be? My key has been safely in my pocket the whole time. The waiter on the ship doesn't have any spare keys of mine either. So after I left, no one and no animal could have sneaked into my cabin, unless it is said that my every move is controlled by some invisible force. My gaze quickly swept across everything in the room. Eventually, my gaze landed on the porthole by the bed. For the human body, the size of the window is too small. If someone tried to escape through this porthole, without a doubt, he would fall and get badly hurt, or he might just fall straight into the sea. Climbing back in would be even more impossible. Although there was no evidence, I couldn't shake my suspicions. Like a big fool, I stepped right up to the porthole, looked outside. There was nothing but sea. I can't see anything. The night stretches southward to the horizon, is pitch black. It is terrifying. A dreadful night. It quietly approaches us like this. Yet it silently watches all living things. Although I have slowly let my guard down, I started taking off my socks, but my eyes never left the closed porthole for a second. Because as time went on, the feeling that something invisible was in my room became even stronger. After undressing, I stood up and turned off the light, but in that moment, I saw outside the porthole beyond the layer of glass, floating deathly pale face. There was no doubt it was the face of a drowning victim. Water droplets clung to the hair, which was tangled with seaweed. In that instant, this strange foreign presence was lifeless, staring relentlessly at me. But there were no signs of blinking. His lips seemed to have turned blue from being frozen for too long, yet he could still muster a faint smile at the corner of his mouth, as if it took all his strength. I finally managed to push myself up from the bed and jumped over. I reached my right hand toward the glass of the porthole, but in the next second, the view was completely obscured by the rain. The ship suddenly sailed into the edge of the storm. The storm came quickly and fiercely. The relentless storm would wash over the rest of the night. Amidst the peaks of the giant waves, the ship's stern spun and rose with the waves. The whole ship was carried into a twisted and bizarre arc. In the blur, eerie face slowly descended along the porthole. The smile on the blue lips never faded from beginning to end. Deny that I was already trembling in fear. As I fumbled to unscrew the bolt on the glass, my fingers slipped more than once. Finally, the porthole opened. A cold wind from the current dimension blew into the room, gently brushing against my already flushed cheeks. I stuck my head out of the porthole, carefully observing along the curved side of the ship, looking up and down. Directly ahead of the port side, there were towering waves like mountains, sweeping across the dark water's surface. Ripples passed beneath the hull. The ship gently rose and fell under the pressure. I was about to close the porthole again, to avoid the heavy rain and waves. A distant, magnificent sound suddenly exploded in my ear. It was the sound of a bell. It came from who knows how many yards outside the ship. It seems to have been born from the womb of the ancient ocean. Crossing millennia, resonating in this world. It's like the shepherds, bells used to signal to the ewes and lambs, but completely different. In short, it's completely out of place in the ocean environment. I was just about to listen carefully, but a strange instantly changed my mind. An extreme fear overwhelmed me. Was inexplicably terrified. I had to do the only thing I could. I closed the porthole. Suddenly my guard, the surgeon, came over. Standing at the door of my cabin, shaking even more violently than I was, even his eye bulged uncontrollably from fear. His face was ashen. His lips trembled, desperately trying to say something. Sir, I stiffly nodded. I gestured for him to speak. He finally could hold back. He quickly said, I just went on a patrol near the sentry. But he couldn't continue. He was shaking badly. His trembling knees knocked together. A click sound. Yes, Sergeant. You went to inspect the sentry as usual. I tried to remain calm. Then I asked him, what happened next? What happened after that? He swallowed hard and finally answered. The sentry who was supposed to be on duty on the main deck in front of the ship, that sentry, he disappeared. Instinctively, I immediately came up with several possible explanations for the absence of the guard on the deck. I couldn't find the sentry on duty. There were multiple plausible reasons. For example, the sentry might have taken the risk of violating regulations and left their post without permission. Maybe he just went to the lifeboat to have a smoke. Or maybe he was just wandering around in the opposite direction of the surgeon's patrol. This led the surgeon to circle the main deck. They never crossed paths. There are too many such common reasons. But I instinctively rejected them, because I felt these reasons are different from the situation tonight. The first obvious reason is that Sergeant Major of the Guard is a veteran Marine who has been sailing the seas for many years. I know he, like many other Marine officers or infantrymen, has been awarded multiple medals to honor his bravery and fearlessness. But even he was completely rattled in this situation. That must mean it's not simple. I quickly recited the military oath I took when I enlisted, not for any other reason, just to motivate myself, to give myself some courage. I started walking toward the door, and he signaled for the sergeant to walk in front of me, but he stubbornly shook his head. He stopped my steps. I had no choice but to stop, because, clearly, this sergeant still hadn't finished telling me everything he needed to report. You may think I'm crazy, he said, but before I tell you everything, Captain, I can't let you go out. It was just when I started my patrol. At first, a sergeant, he was on duty at the stairway at the end of the corridor. He was on duty there. He told me something very strange. At that time, he opened the door to the starboard passage. He wanted to check the weather outside. But just as he was about to close the door, a wave lifted the ship. He said that at that moment, he heard a voice. Captain, a voice that cut across the waves, from many yards away from the ship. The sound that came through, a series of clinking sounds, the officer told me. He heard the sound of bells in the storm. He heard the sound of a bell. I almost couldn't hold back a gasp. But I still let her continue speaking. And then there's also, the surgeon continued saying, after discovering that the sentry was missing, I immediately started looking for someone. But I kept feeling like there was always someone behind me. I took a step, and they took a step. When I turned around, there was nothing on the deck. So I used that moment to put my clothes back on, casually, at this time. You can't find any trace of the sentinel, right? I realized I just asked a pointless question. But he still honestly answered, yes, sir, except like I just told you. Sir, you might think I'm crazy, but I was standing where the last sentry was stationed. I found some wet marks on the deck. I specifically checked them carefully with a flashlight. They were bare footprints, sir. When he said that, I suddenly felt a chill down my spine. Those wet footprints. He continued from where he left off. His tone was both panicked and urgent. Those wet footprints kept leading the sentry. I guess they were leading him forward. I reached the place where the sentry had left. It should have been where he was stationed. Then I guessed he must have jumped straight to the right railing. I inspected it more carefully than before. The footprints next to the railing, I'm sure they were definitely left by a human. And the marks from the footprints had already blurred. The soles were pressed out very wide. It's like she's holding something in her arms. Or maybe she's carrying a heavy package. Can't stand his rambling. He finally spoke, saying, "Oh God, Sergeant, what are you trying to say?" Incoherent, just like I said. "Sir, I think there's something seriously wrong with this ship. A big problem. Something's dragging the sentry's body away." I took a deep breath, pushed past him in the doorway, and hurried to the starboard main deck. The sergeant behind me was still frantic, constantly stepping on my heels. In the midst of the cold wind, I glanced at the side of the ship. What I saw was the raging sea. Suddenly I stopped. The sergeant behind me let out a faint groan. I could understand him, because out there in the boundless sea, once again that soul-stirring bell tolled. I rushed to the railing, leaning as far forward as I could, trying to pierce the darkness of the sea to find the source of the bell, but ultimately I found nothing. Neither the relatively calm surface of the sea, nor the hollows where the waves met, or the peaks that rise up. There are no signs to be seen. 2 green phosphorescent dots hang in the distance, like the pupils of a snake watching the passing ships. But when I squint and look closely, wanting to uncover what lies beneath the light spots, a thick water wall mist rises from the surface, inserting itself between the 2 flames, and so the light spot disappeared like that. Next, we found the sentinel lying on the ground. His face was down. The sergeant should have noticed him during his patrol, but he didn't. I turned the sentinel's body over. The cold touch of his hand made me shiver. The body was completely soaked. His body was completely naked. His lips and cheeks were a frozen blue, as if his body had been tied to the stern of a ship and dragged through the waves for hours. Behind him, the sergeant, terrified out of his wits, chatted his teeth incessantly in the freezing air. The body of the dead sentry at his feet was already blue from the cold. As I said before, completely naked. The enormous, wet footprints on the deck looked like they were dredged up from the sea. The strange bell that echoed across the sea to the ship need not be described. And half an hour ago, I saw with my own eyes through the porthole of my cabin that deathly white, ghoulish face. It's enough to make one think there's definitely a connection. Chilling. Is there a rational explanation for this series of events? If the bell wasn't a hallucination, we all heard it. Then where did it come from? What was it that came from the sea and walked barefoot across the silent deck of the warship? Before I passed away, did my sentinel actually see something? Something attacking him? These things are all tangled together, twisted into a chaotic knot. It felt as though hell had descended upon this wasteland of the sea. The time is already past midnight. I think anyone would somewhat understand my feelings. After all, what kind of person can manage to be fearless in the face of unknown and elusive terror? When I turned around, I accidentally bumped into the sergeant behind me. The sergeant was clearly startled by my sudden movement without any warning. He jumped in surprise. It was almost instinctive to run toward the rear of the warship, but after calming down, regained control, and suppressed the scream that was about to escape my lips. I took a step forward to check. He followed right behind me. In the silence of our footsteps, a series of fantastical images unfolded. A thought flashed rapidly through my mind. For some reason, I suddenly thought of the story of Lorelei. Could it be that there was a maiden, using her enchanting song to lure sailors to their deaths? In the darkness, I widened my eyes, trying to search for any clues. Secretly prayed, "Please don't let me discover any signs." My thoughts drifted back to a much earlier time, when I couldn't yet read or write. But my nature drew me to knowledge. I would browse through pictures in ancient historical texts to satisfy my thirst for knowledge. Son. As I approached the stern of the ship, an illustration from an ancient book, etched deep in my memory, was suddenly revived in my mind. It was a towering, incredibly monstrous childlike creature. It slowly rose from behind the horizon. Even the golden sunlight was completely blocked by its massive form. The monster's long left arm stretches out towards the front of the picture, as if trying to seize something. Meanwhile, its right hand is already raised high, holding a medieval sailing ship that has lifted off the sea. To it, the enormous ship is nothing more than a speck of dust it casually swept up. At this moment, I have finally realized more clearly than ever the brilliance of this painting. It is used to warn of the terrifying things that lie beyond the horizon. So far, small sailing boat or large ship has dared to challenge the silent depths of the open sea ahead. I took large strides toward the stern of the ship while carefully considering the meaning of the image that suddenly appeared in my mind. But I hadn't reached the end yet. Fear once again tightened its grip around my throat. "I'm coming, my dearest," a loud, high-pitched voice, calls filled with joy, came from ahead of me. I saw a young tree emerging from the huge shadow cast by the ship's smokestack. Excitedly, running wildly towards the starboard railing. In a flash, I suddenly saw his face clearly. It was a face extremely distorted, mixed with hope. It was as if he had seen someone he loved still on land, somewhere beyond the railing. Just as he was about to rush towards the railing, he quickly slowed his pace. He threw the rifle aside and slowly seemed to indulge in enjoying the joy of anticipation. His eyes never left the railing by the side of the ship from beginning to end, and I was captivated by this scene. I stopped in my tracks, wanting to see what he was staring at from afar. The sound of bells was heard at that moment, and the bells rang again. Ding ding dong dong, like signals directing the young man towards a huge dark shadow of time. He broke free from the shadow the sentry had just stepped out of, looming high above the unfortunate youth. Just then, the ship rose again on the waves, and the entire starboard side slid uncontrollably downwards, until the sea water, filled with white foam, overflowed the deck. When the ship finally straightened itself again, the sentinel had already disappeared into the waves. Behind the spot where the sentinel vanished, from the depths of the cold, motionless sea, a long, dragging scream echoed. It was not a cry born from fear, no one caused by pain or sorrow. The scream was clearly one of ecstatic joy, statigible joy. He disappeared. I asked blankly, "Sergeant, what happened?" But what took him away wasn't the waves. Because he could have saved himself at any time by grabbing the railing, right? The sergeant, however, countered with a question. "Did you see the shadow just now, Lieutenant?" We took another step forward, halting our previous one, walking toward the stern. All around, on both sides of the ship, beyond the ship itself, that strange, unexplained bell sound kept following us. Mournful and endless, we finally reached the rear of the warship. I stared intently at the ghostly wake directly below, a deep stare. I was on high alert. I didn't dare relax for a moment. The wake almost disappeared immediately. Suddenly, I seemed to see something. A flash of insight. I understood the reason. The other related mysteries. I think I might have an idea now. Behind our ship, there's a large mass of drifting, odorless seaweed. It follows us like a shadow, floating on the water's surface, almost like a giant raft. In the dark corners around us, there are vast expanses of seaweed stretching out, extending beyond the range of my sight. It's all seaweed. There is so much of it, endless and boundless. Yet amidst the darkness and the raging storm, it accompanies our ship, maintaining synchronicity with the rising and falling sounds. The bell rang again. This was nothing unusual. But when I looked again at the seaweed as the bell rang, the roots of my hair on my scalp uncontrollably stiffened. Patches of seaweed, upon hearing the ocean's bell ringing, seemed to suddenly come alive. They swayed wantonly. The long tendrils began to tug at both sides of our ship. It was as if they were brought to life by the sound of a bell. The seaweed curled in thousands of ways, scraping against each other. The slippery twisting of the upper and lower layers. It was as if the entire mass of seaweed were dying in a desperate struggle. This isn't seaweed at all. This is more like the whole world. All the snakes were gathering at the stern of our ship, coalescing into something utterly evil and disgusting. They writhed and tumbled in the water. And in the gaps between the tentacles and tendrils, I could see the black water beneath the seaweed. It was as if they were deliberately showing me the waves. For a moment, I was captivated by this strange sight. My gaze couldn't be pulled away from that dark expanse of water, and a moment later, two people emerged from the fissure in the seaweed. The first thing I saw was a body. He must have been dead. His face was pale and withered, but the ice-blue lips still wore a faint smile. Isn't this the unfortunate sentinel from earlier? The one who jumped into the sea just now, in front of me and the sergeant. But he didn't climb out. He was pulled out from the deep black sea, held in someone's arms. I refuse to call the creature holding him a human. I almost don't know what words to use to describe it. A woman. But I did understand this. The moment our eyes met, I immediately understood the sentinel in her arms, the Xe on her face. The woman's chest was exposed, full and attention-grabbing. Her lips were as red as a blooming rose. Her smooth, thick hair was as black as a raven's wings. It adorned her marvelous body. She was also draped in a charming cloak. It fluttered freely in the storm. She shifted her gaze away from me. She lifted one fair, slender arm above the surface of the water. Ears. The sound of a ringing bell suddenly filled the air. The large seaweed begins to move, curling its tendrils. It twists and approaches the ship from above. However, one cluster suddenly detaches from the whole. It tightly clings to the woman. Then it shifts away and leaves. The beautiful woman is left holding nothing. The sentry's body is instantly taken away by the seaweed. I instinctively turned my face away, because there was a feeling deep down telling me that before I looked into the eyes of this creature again, must first art my gaze. Otherwise, I would face great danger. A wall made of seaweed crawled up the right side of the ship. It first covered the railing, then paused for a moment before crawling onto the deck. Then it landed on the spot and slowly writhed. In a moment, the seaweed wall twisted into a strange shape. For a few brief moments, I thought it resembled the shape of a person, and sure enough, body was expelled from the center of the seaweed mass. My body was soaking wet, cold and pale all over. The second sentry was carried back onto the ship like that, just like the sentry's remains we had previously found on the deck. I had to be shocked by the mysterious sight I witnessed tonight. Shocked, and tried to make sense of it based on my past experiences. Let's find some plausible explanations. I know, our route deviates from the common shipping lanes. We're heading west. Even if there are any, few ships dare to pass through in these 7 days. We haven't even seen a wisp of smoke on the horizon, much less encountered a single vessel. This is the plain, stark truth. The question arises, why did those ships intentionally avoid this route? I can't answer these doubts in my mind. I can only pose this question, and sincerely hope that these questions will never have an answer. The dead sentinel returned to the ship. Like the first sentinel, it was completely naked. I felt a sudden wave of nausea, deliberately averted my gaze. When I looked back, the seaweed was gone. But the wet footprints left on the deck were still clearly visible. To ask myself, the monster from the deep sea, who will be the next to be taken from this doomed ship? Who will it be? Decisively drew my pistol and returned to the stern. No matter who or what this deep-sea creature is, she has already taken the lives of 2 soldiers, but no matter how she feels, can escape death. Since she is not immortal, the bullet will help me end her life. As my thoughts raced, I suddenly stopped, because I saw the woman who had once held a dead body, now standing before me, right between me and the deck. She smiled dreamily. Speckled droplets of water fell on the deck. There were small ripples. They gently rippled across her naked body. Shimmering, my arms fell naturally to my sides. My pistol dropped onto the deck, with a soft thud asterisk. In an instant, I was like that sentry just now, and confused. I started imitating his actions, step by step, walking towards that woman. That mysterious woman. She opened her wet, glistening arms, wanting to draw me into her embrace. My eyes were completely mesmerized. I am mesmerized by the magnificent miracle she has shown me. To me, she exudes a divine power from head to toe. From head to toe, feet. Feet. She has no feet. Where her feet should be, there is only emptiness. Looking up, where are her legs? It didn't replace the legs. It was a slippery, scaled cylinder. It was like a snake's tail attached to a woman's body. I wanted that room. A scream of fear and disbelief surged within me. But it was too late. She had already tightly held me in her arms. There was no way for me to escape. With the touch of those slender arms, I increasingly enjoyed the sensation. Slowly, I lost the urge to struggle. At this moment, I understood what had happened to the two sentinels, and I knew the same fate awaited me. At this moment, there was nothing in this world more alluring than this bizarre creature. Follow me. There are more meaningful things to do than diving into the ocean with me. Lieutenant, what's wrong with you? The guard's voice sounded anxiously behind me. His tone was filled with extreme fear, but I no longer cared about those things. Creatures from the deep sea, the pair of balanced, warm arms surrounded me. The incredibly pleasant chime rang clearly in my ears at the same time. For me, the concept of the world was already falling apart. Only these two things were undeniably real. I was lifted onto the railing by the woman. My body slowly turned towards the sea. There was no struggle at all. It felt as comfortable as collapsing onto a couch. When I suddenly snapped back to reality, I realized I had truly lost myself in it just now. I had already gotten lost in the water. As the ship's propeller spun round and round beneath me, I spin with the current. I hold my breath, forcing myself to endure, but it feels like my lungs are about to burst. I try everything I can to swim back to the shore, to get even a single breath of air. But the currents from all directions confuse my mind, leaving me completely disoriented, unsure of which way is up. On my way back to the surface, I struggle with all my might, but the effect is barely noticeable, because at my knee, there is a pulling force preventing me, as if trying to keep me fixed in the sea. Silent reproach sounds in my ear. She is pleading with me to stay, right there in the water. Something was bewitching me, making all my efforts seem foolish and superfluous. Even momentarily gave up on the idea of returning to the surface, of breathing air. My eyes had been closed, but upon contact with the water, they instinctively opened. My lips were also firmly pressed together. It can be said that it was these two lips that saved my collapsing sanity in life, because it made me think of the lips of those two corpses, cold and stiff, symbolizing an irreversible death. I finally managed to struggle back to life. My hands, grabbing wildly, caught a rope. It was a rope lowered from the stern of the ship. It's used to measure speed. I quickly climbed upwards. One moment I was underwater. The next I could suddenly lift my nostrils above the surface, gasp for air. Large amounts of seaweed surrounded me, bobbing up and down on the turbulent sea. Heaven knows how I got back on the boat. But when I woke up, it was already breakfast time. I immediately sent someone to find the sergeant of the guards. I asked him what happened after I returned to the ship last night. Sergeant, I suddenly asked him. The guard stared at me blankly, his loyalty inexplicably in question. It was as if I had gone mad. I didn't understand what you said. He finally admitted it. I rubbed my head, slowly leaning against the pillow. Sitting up, have we already passed through that area with the large seaweed? Did we? Lieutenant, are you joking with me? Piece of land is at least 2,000 miles away from our ship, except the ocean floor. Where else are there seaweed? I don't understand what you mean. Okay, let's pretend I didn't say anything. I can only skip this topic. What time was it when you last patrolled the sentry post last night? What time? Before midnight, sir. I immediately questioned. Are they all at their posts? Yes, sir. Now that it's come to this, I must ask that question. What about the bell? I didn't expect to see that look of doubt once again appear on Middle-earth's face. This makes me realize he still doesn't understand what I mean. So how much of my experience actually happened? And how much was just my imagination? I had to try a different approach. Did you ever go on patrol past the sentry after midnight? The sergeant lowered his head somewhat timidly. It was his duty as a guard. Between midnight and morning, he should check all the sentries. But his reaction clearly shows negligence. Did you gather all the sentries this morning? Is everyone present? If you don't know, you should go check immediately. 10 minutes later, the sergeant returned. His face was ashen. He reported to me that 2 sentries were missing. I couldn't see them anywhere on the ship. He reported to me the names of the 2 people. In an instant, my thoughts returned to that strange and eerie night that had just passed. The 2 bodies that had been brought back from the deep sea to the ship. Whose were they? Or rather, in whose embrace did I fall into such a deep sleep? This remains an unsolved mystery to this day. The question remains unanswered in my heart, but I know 1,000 miles north of Honolulu, in the waters near 180 degrees longitude, some strange things and sounds were still lurking there. And after experiencing that terrifying night, the most bizarre event I encountered was when I woke up the next day in my room. The clothes I was wearing were completely dry, but my hair was covered in salt and had hardened from drying, and there was a strong smell of seaweed in the room. I turned my gaze to the window glass again. There is a thin layer of lipstick stain on the outside of the glass, the imprint of lips left behind, a blurred outline. It seems to confirm that there was once a face, pressed firmly against the glass from the outside, as if something or someone was there from evening until morning. A while, peering into the cabin. So the bells, I can still hear their sound in my memory. Sometimes after midnight, I wake up startled from the sea. The sway and jolt of the ship tell me another storm has come back to visit me. That concludes Arthur J. Burks's The Ocean Bell. This suspense story could be said to depict humankind's fear and dread of the unknown seas. Burks, who joined the Marine Corps during World War I, combined this terror with the inspiration of his military life to create this short story. Although this story was created a year before the masterpiece The Call of Cthulhu, it still has a strong Lovecraftian feel. Before your sand values drop to zero, let's return to appreciate the Gothic horror works in the Dunwich Horror. Let's appreciate the Gothic horror works in the Dunwich Horror. Charing Cross Road, London, the late Harry Elvet. The location of Sir Berkeley's former residence. Investigators found this unfinished letter among his mountains of files. June 10, 1925. Dear Mark, since sending the postcard, I haven't received a reply. Tentatively, Surmas. For some reason, you probably didn't receive it. I am currently at the summer retreat in the wild high marshlands, the Lowell Manor. It's very peaceful here. I hope you can visit me as you said before, give me a surprise. Because this is definitely the kind of house that you would love. It's remarkably similar to the manor described in Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's The Hound of the Baskervilles. The manor is strikingly similar. There are local rumors in this area that say this manor is the dwelling place of evil spirits. Naturally, I scoffed at that. But I indirectly came to believe in this statement because of its significant archaeological value, so I'll go ahead. I came to this old tower in the English wilderness. Can you believe it? I've only been here for 12 days, and I've already searched everywhere, from the cellar to the attic. I found a very old chest in the attic. Inside there were about 8 or 9 books. Why say about? Some of them are in such poor condition that it's impossible to tell if they are the same edition. The most complete one I kept should be Bram Stoker's Dracula. I can't believe it. The Dracula asterisk in this building is actually the first edition when the book was first published. You must come see it. Promise me, will you? The remaining book fragments, I'll just have to slowly identify and study them. It's fine. Fortunately, during those 3 days, the villa was covered in thick fog. I couldn't go anywhere. So far, I've discovered that the authors of those books include Edgar Allan Poe, August Strindberg and Droza, and so on. You should know that these authors' styles, even their fields, are completely different. I'm so excited right now. I'm so curious about who lived here before. To be so obsessed with these authors, to the point of collecting various editions of their works. Before the fog rolled in, I asked the nearby residents. Strictly speaking, the nearest residents are people from a village several miles away. But besides telling me some unrealistic legends about this old house, they offered almost no clues. The owner of a small-town general store told me, 15 years ago, 4 girls disappeared here at night. People have always believed that the first owner of the manor kidnapped them. Rowell says he's still hidden in this building, and that he plots against every visitor. He's been lurking like this for over 100 years. That's ridiculous. Mark, I've searched this whole building, top to bottom. But I didn't see any energetic, 100-year-old man who robs for money and women. However, the boss did give me some other interesting information. He said that the older generation called this the Bat Clock Tower, for some unknown reason. Mortimer said he did find bats in the cellar. He also mentioned that there was once a time when one almost flew past and brushed against his face and bangs. At that time, I immediately took Liam down to the cellar to look for them, but we couldn't find a single one. So why is it called the Bat Bell Tower? I really don't understand. But Mortimer's experience seems like a prelude. Then strange things happened one after another. I'll list the most serious ones for you. I hope you formed some theories on your way here. The day before the fog rolled in, Mortimer ran breathlessly into the study and told me he couldn't light the lamp in the cellar. Leon, and I believed him, went down to check and found we couldn't light the oil lamp either. Not even a match would work. The two maids initially thought it was some kind of ghost, but I told them it was probably a disruption of the air in the cellar. Our flashlights worked fine, but once inside the cellar, the light would instantly dim. I can't explain this. As a devout Catholic, took a few drops from a bottle of holy water yesterday. He kept it with him ever since. Then he went back down to the cellar. He told that his purpose was to drive out the evil spirit inside. The premise is if there really are evil spirits. A while ago, I noticed at the bottom of the steps, there's a huge stone tablet. When Liam went down the steps, a large drop of holy water fell onto that stone tablet like this. Actually, when the holy water touched the tablet, the droplet began to make a hissing sound rapidly. Mumbled a prayer. But halfway through, he suddenly stopped. Then he panicked and fled from the place. He kept muttering that this was the population of hell, with the embodiment of demons personally guarding it. He said things like this. I have to admit, Mark started to get a little scary. So after that, we became more afraid and cautious. Last night, there were 3 of us. We squeezed together in the spacious living room. Then suddenly, the lights went out. No, I wrote it wrong. I should say the lights exploded. It was like some kind of supernatural force. Instantly blew our lights apart. There wasn't a breath of wind inside or outside at the time, but sitting opposite the broken lamp, I genuinely felt a chill. Loon and Mortimer didn't notice anything. It felt like there was something invisible, sitting right in front of me. It blew a cold gust of air directly at me, as if it had shattered the oil lamp. That feeling was as if some enormous, invisible bird of prey had flapped its wings. Or perhaps it was like a bat. Undoubtedly, in this house, there must be some fundamental flaw secretly at work. I'm determined to find this root cause, no matter the consequences. My conviction ends here. Or rather, it should have been continued in the days that followed. Sir Harry, however, is dead. His body remains at Lowell Manor. 2 doctors are performing the autopsy. One of them suddenly stopped. He said he couldn't explain the shocking amount of blood loss. Unexplainable. Mordant that Mordant. His assistant also wiped his brow. I can't say anything. Dr. Green. He's almost bled to death. To save him would be like reviving a corpse that's been dead for years. He smiled, but Green glared at him. Regarding his blood loss, my initial judgment is internal bleeding. But based on the expression on his face, there's no basis for it. Matat, you better not lift the cloth on his face anymore. That expression is too terrifying. I've been in this profession for over 20 years, and I don't even dare to look at it too much. Also, Dr. Green. It must have been something terrifying that led to his death. Or rather, he witnessed something terrifying. I think it's the latter. When we announce his death, it's best to attribute the cause of death to internal bleeding and stroke. Morton nodded and said, You're right. I'll listen to you. They silently left the makeshift mortuary quartz table. They walked toward the old stack of books, bound with iron chains and padlocks. Dr. Green put his hand in his pocket. He took out a match. Mo lit it with a flick. He threw it onto the book. Then don't mention anything to anyone. That's perfect, Doctor. Shortly after July 17, 1925, Sir Harry's diary was discovered at Lowell Manor. The following is an excerpt. Last night I had a strange dream. I dreamt that I was at my father's castle in Lancaster. In the nearby forest, I met a very beautiful girl. I was overwhelmed with excitement in my dream. We passionately kissed for at least half an hour. Such a strange dream. I'm sure I had some nightmares after that. But I can't remember them anymore. When I got up and washed this morning, I found my face was completely pale. And pale. Leon told me he had similar dreams. I couldn't understand his sexual orientation was different from mine, and he was a misogynist. But in the dream, the experiences were strikingly similar to what I had dreamt. Today, Mortimer was up at the crack of dawn. He came to find me. He said he didn't want to stay here for a single moment longer, because he firmly believed he had encountered a ghost. He saw a handsome old man. And this old man actually kissed him. Although I was reminded of my dream with Liam, I still persuaded him to stay here, and I solemnly instructed him, stop dwelling on this. He might just not have slept well. However, Liam claimed that the night before, in his mind, he once again recalled every detail of that dream. He also said his body started to feel unwell. I suggested he see a doctor in town first, but he firmly rejected it. He said he had holy water. No need to worry, he would just drop a few drops on himself tonight. No evil spirits would dare to come near. In the time that followed, I conducted some investigations. I found that the description of that Baron Lowell was almost identical to the ghost Mortimer had seen in his dream. I also learned that when the last heir of the Lowell family was still alive, several children went missing in the countryside. It's not that there was any real connection between them, but it seems the ignorant villagers blamed the Baron for the incident. How pitiful he must have been. Leon claims that he hasn't had that dream again because of the holy water's powerful effects. On a side note, I did have a dream last night. Mortimer left. He claimed he couldn't bear living in the same house as the devil. It seems that he really did see the ghost of old Lowell, although Lee and I both scoff at such claims. The same dream attacked me again last night. I felt really uncomfortable when I woke up this morning, but during the day, it's easy to shake off that feeling. Leon has already used up all the holy water, but tomorrow is the weekend. He could get some from the village parish during Mass. I came to the village this morning to try and find a cook to help, but the reality is hopeless. They claim that no one in this town would risk going into the Bat Belfry. Even a weekly salary of £100 couldn't change their determination. This forced me to live alone, or to reassign a chef from London. Last night, we had the same dream again. I felt weak all over. Felt the same. He went to see a doctor. The town doctor asked him exactly whether it was a cut or something else that caused such a serious injury, excessive blood loss, or symptoms of internal bleeding. But he denied them all. The doctor prescribed Leon some raw onions. He fed him with other things. By the way, today Leon forgot about the holy water. The nightmare returned. This time, Leon had a nightmare very different from the ones before. It was about an old man. He said the old man bit him. I asked him to show me the spot where the old man bit him in the dream. Show me. When he loosened his collar, I indeed saw 2 small holes on his neck. At this moment, both he and I were already weakened. Today, Leon also left the manor. I'm sure he must have gone mad. He who was once terrified of the cellar actually crazily demanded that I give him the key, let him go into the cellar. He said something down there was strongly attracting him. I didn't stop him at first, but as I was absorbed in my reading, he screamed and practically clawed his way up the cellar steps. He yelled at me in the living room, "Sir, let me go. Please let me go. There's a devil. Swear to God, there's a devil here." He wasn't asking my opinion, because he just threw open the door and rushed out without any luggage. I chased after him as fast as I could and shouted loudly, but I only received a reply, a few words faintly carried on the wind. And some Latin words referring to demons and God. I didn't chase after him. Instead, I returned to the manor to think and wonder. Lames is a term for a type of female vampire. Only a few wizards deeply versed in esotericism. Only then did I begin to understand. And the Book of Thoth. This is a book of spells from ancient Egypt. How did Leon know about these things? For a few minutes, a very crazy thought emerged in my mind. I thought of the Book of Thoth. It's hidden somewhere within this villa. As I pondered deeply, trying to figure out the connection between that stone tablet and the Book of Thoth, I finally became certain that the book was stored beneath the stone tablet at the bottom of the cellar steps. I decided to go down and investigate. I got the Book of Thoth. Just as I expected. It was under the stone tablet. Although when I was struggling to move the stone tablet by myself, the airflow in the cellar went haywire. It was like a subterranean gale, as if there were no vents. I guess. Maybe it's a ghost protecting the books. Unfortunately, this book is firmly sealed with layers of chains and locks. It's tightly shut. I'll definitely find a way to pry it open later. Definitely after I sleep off this tiredness. I had another dream last night, and I can almost swear. I saw with my own eyes in a dream, the ghost of old Lowell, followed by 4 beautiful girls. What a marvelous coincidence this is. Today I feel even weaker. Undoubtedly, something has grown in this house. It's not bats. It's vampires. It's good heavens, if I could find their bodies, I would impale them with sharpened stakes. I'm convinced it would work. Later that day, I made another startling discovery. I returned to the place where the stale was. Below him is the cave where the Book of Thoth is located, and beneath that, a rock had collapsed. I descended further and discovered a tomb. Inside there were about 20 or so slender skeletons, and it was easy to tell that all of them were children. If this really is Lemes's residence, then it's obvious that these skeletons are the unfortunate victims who fell prey to them. But I still firmly believe that there's a third cave beyond this one, where the bodies of those vampires are hidden. I kept reviewing De Rosa's parapsychological works. Then he immediately came up with a brilliant plan to find a vampire's lair, a perfect plan to locate it. Although for decades in my life, I have always treated ghost stories and legends as jokes, now I will use the Book of Thoth to summon the vampire right before me. Then I will force to reveal the place where they have hidden the corpse. According to De Rosa's theory, this is achievable. The time has come, it's 9 o'clock. The timing is perfect. I am about to begin summoning the vampire. If anyone happens to pass by here, I sincerely hope he won't interrupt my work. And please don't tell anyone in town what happened here. I don't want to spend the rest of my life known as Sir Madman. As I mentioned earlier, this book had very heavy chains on it. I had a hard time opening it. Finally, I opened it. I found what I needed. The section that recorded the method to summon a vampire. I began chanting the incantation. I could clearly feel that the atmosphere in the room had subtly changed. It gradually condensed into an unbearable darkness. The air in the room began to swirl powerfully. The lights went out. I believe the vampires will appear soon. My premonition was correct. Shadows began to form in the room. They were becoming more and more defined. Finally, the features of a man and 4 women materialized. They moved towards me. They cast an extremely dark, hair-raising gaze. They were staring at me. I'd completely forgotten that I was the intruder, that I had disturbed them, and that they would certainly attack me, but I'd forgotten to set up protective wards. Yes, they got closer. They walked towards the large quartz table where I was sitting. It seemed like I had no way to focus my attention on Lowell at the center, because of those 4 Lemmes, their crimson lips and graceful postures made my head spin. I summoned all my will to try to resist, but I remain indifferent. Every time, when I manage to pull myself away from the hypnotic temptation of Lemmes for a few seconds, I can see Lowell moving a little closer to me. A little closer. A little closer still. Their faces are already pressed against mine. I can already feel it, the growing in the throat. He has already. The last page of the diary is stained with dried blood, and on the final page, there are a series of blood-red words. Surely this humble human must have thought this way in their final moment before death. Dreams and reality entangle. The elements of a vampire. It also incorporates unresolved horror. This is Derleth, in one of the earliest works in Weird Tales magazine. The sense of unknown fear shown to a greater or lesser extent in the story also seems to foreshadow Derleth's later founding of Arkham House Publishers and his becoming one of the main contributors to the Cthulhu mythos. At this point, if any of the fans are still awake, let's wrap things up with the terrifying Master Lovecraft and his collaborative work with his wife at the time. Let's bring it to a thrilling conclusion. Fate is not always unchanging. Its dramatic effects and climax often arrive when you least expect them. On August 8, 1922, before that terrible event occurred, Martin Beach had just experienced a period of delightful wonder and joy. On May 17th of that year, Captain James P. led the entire crew of the Alma, a fishing boat from Gloucester. After more than 40 hours of battle, a massive sea creature was successfully hunted. The size and appearance of the prey quickly caused a huge sensation in the scientific community. Due to its significance, several naturalists from Boston took necessary measures to preserve the specimen, to avoid causing any potential damage to the specimen. The creature is approximately 50 feet long slip of the tongue. Its body is cylindrical in shape, with a diameter of about 10 feet. In terms of morphology, there is no doubt that it shares some genetic relation with a type of gill-bearing fish. However, there are also some puzzling and bizarre features, such as its degenerated forelimbs and six-toed claws, replacing the pectoral fins that should have been there, as well as its unusual mouth, skin covered in thick scales, deeply sunken eyes, were all as incredible as its enormous size. This naturally led to widespread speculation among the public, especially when naturalists claimed that this monster was still a newly hatched young monster. Public interest was raised to an unprecedented height. True to his shrewd nature, Captain Orme procured a cargo ship large enough to fit the entire monster in its hold, and immediately arranged an exhibition to show off his prize. With his superb carpentry skills, he quickly converted the cargo ship into an excellent maritime seaside museum. He then sailed the ship to the affluent coastal paradise of Martin Beach, docking it at the hotel's pier, and earning a steady stream of admission fees. The creature itself is already rare enough, and in the eyes of the researchers who came from afar, it is far more than that. Clearly, it holds many more significant values. Thus, this unique creature became the most talked about highlight of the season. Many people believe it was precious enough to cause a revolutionary upheaval in the scientific community, a truly earth-shattering change. Naturalists clearly indicated this monster was completely unlike the large fish of similar size previously caught off the Florida coast. It was clearly from a much more distant, deeper ocean. Obviously, it came from the far more distant deep sea, living at an unbelievably great depth. There may be several thousand feet of it. However, its brain and major organs are surprisingly well developed. The proportion they occupy in the monster's body exceeds all fish discovered so far. The time came to the morning of July 20th. Because the ship and the strange treasures on board were lost, attention to the matter rose again. In the storm the night before, the ship slipped away from its anchor. On board was a guard who, despite the severe weather, insisted on staying on the ship to sleep. And just like that, they disappeared forever from sight. Driven by widespread scientific interest, numerous fishing boats from Gloucester assisted Captain Orme in conducting a thorough search of the sea. But besides sparking people's interest and becoming a topic of conversation, nothing came of it. By August 7th, Captain Orme had given up all hope. He returned to the Wavecrest Hotel and closed his business in Martin's Beach. Afterwards, he also met with some of the scientists who remained there. We had some simple conversations. But the events I'm about to describe took place on August 8th. At dusk, gray seabirds circled low over the shore. Full moon, to paint a shimmering path across the water. Remember this scene, because every detail from that time is crucial. There are still a few strollers on the beach, and swimmers who are reluctant to leave. They come from different places. From far away northern settlements and villages scattered among the green mountains, to the tall towers of the neighboring Shangren Hotel. Another group of onlookers are also within sight, comfortably situated under the hotel's high ceilings. Lanterns illuminated the corridor where they were. These spectators, including Captain Orme and several researchers, had gathered on this beach long before the horrific events. They were already here, just like the others at the hotel at this time. Therefore, there was naturally no shortage of witnesses. But they were unsure of what they had seen and heard, a sense of confusion and fear. Undoubtedly, this made their testimonies muddled and unsettling, although no one could explain clearly at what moment the terrifying event began. Most people still noticed unusual characteristic that made them freeze time at the full moon on the fog-covered coastline, about 1 foot above the surface. They paid special attention to the moon because the scene they saw seemed to have a subtle connection with the moon. Deliberate, ominous ripple spread along the moonlit, shimmering path, rolling in from the distant coastline. Before it even reached the shore, the ripple on the surface of the sea slowly dissipated. Many people only after the event, and with reminders, gradually recalled the ripple they had overlooked. But it seemed very conspicuous in terms of its height and movement. It possesses characteristics that are completely different from other waves. Some even claim that this wave is both clever and sly. As it slowly disappears behind the distant black rocks, a desperate and agonized scream suddenly emerges from the shimmering sea. The owner of this scream seems to be facing the threat of death. This evoked people's compassion. The first to react were the two lifeguards on duty. They were both strong young men, wearing white swimsuits. Their profession was clearly marked in bold red letters. Although they were used to dealing with rescue work, I've grown accustomed to the screams of panicked drowning people. But amidst these piercing cries, they couldn't see the drowning person they were supposed to save. Driven by their well-trained sense of duty, they ignored their doubts and proceeded according to their usual standard operating procedure. One of them quickly grabbed a lifebuoy with a rope attached. One end of these ropes was firmly held in his hand. He ran swiftly along the coastline to where the crowd had gathered, then twisted his body, using the centrifugal force of the rotation to throw the hollow lifebuoy far out towards the source of the sound. When the lifebuoy disappeared into the waves, people anxiously waited for the unfortunate person to surface, because the screams they heard earlier were so full of agony. They desperately hoped to see the thick rescue rope pull the person back to safety, but people quickly realized that this was not a simple and swift rescue operation, because those two muscular lifeguards, no matter how hard they pulled the rope, couldn't drag the object on the other side. Instead, they were pulled back in the opposite direction by an equal or even greater force. Only a few seconds later, they were pulled into the water by the force coming from the lifebuoy. They were dragged underwater. One of the people steadied himself and immediately called for help from those on the shore. He threw the remaining rope to them. In a short time, a rescue team made up of brave and kind-hearted people was formed. Among them, Captain On led the charge. Strong hands. They desperately pulled on the thick rope, but to no avail. They pulled with all their might here, only to find the other end pulling even harder. This directly resulted in the rope, under immense pressure, becoming as stiff and rigid as a steel bar. Neither side showed any sign of loosening. At this moment, neither the rescue team struggling to pull or other onlookers on the beach were all curious about what exactly was in the sea that had such immense power. The possibility of a drowning person had long been ruled out. Instead, imaginations ran wild with whales, submarines, monsters, even demons. All sorts of speculations filled their minds. The rescuers had originally come to save a drowning person. They have gathered here. Curiosity has become the main driving force for them to continue pulling. They've made up their minds to bring this thing up, to unravel this mystery. The discussions, people unanimously believe that a giant whale swallowed the lifebuoy. Captain Arn, as a natural leader, shouted to the people on the shore, asking them to bring a small boat. This way, he could board the boat and approach the giant beast. Then he would subdue it with a harpoon in one strike and drag it onto the shore. A few people quickly scattered, looking for the right tools. Meanwhile, several more people rushed over. They took the taut rope from Orn's hands, replacing the captain in the task of pulling. If a small team were to be formed to hunt in the sea, then the captain would naturally stay with his own ship. Orn himself had a different opinion of the scene before him. Because of his own encounter with such a strange and enormous creature, he had dealt with them before, so he thought that what was in the sea might not necessarily be a whale. He even wondered if the creature he had previously salvaged, that newly hatched juvenile monster, had already reached an astounding 50 feet. What would an adult specimen be like? How much power would it have? However, immediately, a shocking fact suddenly emerged. The message it brought changed the tone of the entire situation from astonishment to horror. It left everyone gathered there, the laborers pulling the ropes and the spectators, stunned and speechless. As Captain Arn prepared to release the rope, turning away from his position, he found his hands held down by an incredible force. firmly pressed against the surface. In a flash, Captain Orn realized he couldn't release the rope. His predicament was immediately noticed by the others, so everyone tested their own situation. However, I encountered the exact same problem as Captain Orn. This is true. An undeniable fact. Every person involved in the rescue was bound to the rope by some mysterious, irresistible force, a force beyond our control. It wasn't stuck, glued, or tied, or some other common reason. In short, the rope was slowly and mercilessly dragging them into the icy sea. Silent terror ensued. The audience was stunned and bewildered by what they saw. Their minds were in chaos. Their low morale at the time was well reflected in their later explanations. Amidst the varied accounts, and those self-justifying, awkward apologies for what seemed then to be cold, negative actions. I know that feeling. Because I was there. I was one of the audience. Even amongst the struggling, even those who fought valiantly, after almost frantic screams and futile groans. I too had to succumb to this numbing influence. Before the unknown power, I silently accepted the impending doom. We stood under the pale moonlight, blindly grappling with a ghostly, ill-fated destiny. The seawater gradually rose to our knees, then covered our bones. We could only endure in this environment, the monotonous back and forth swaying. Part of the moon quietly hid itself in the clouds, casting only a dim half-lit glow. The people gripping the ropes lined up, resembling some kind of giant sea creature. An atmosphere of death gradually enveloped them, and the centipede could only writhe and struggle in its death throes. As the force from both sides gradually increased, the rope grew increasingly stiff. The surging waves constantly soaked the rope, causing one of the tightly twisted strands to uncontrollably swell. The tide slowly advanced towards the land, steadfast and mercilessly, submerging the beach that had just been filled with children's laughter and joy. As the water slowly rose to their feet, the terrified onlookers blindly retreated. But the group holding the rope was already a considerable distance from the shore. They were far from the spectators on the coast. Many that were already half submerged by the rising tide. No one spoke. The entire beach fell into an eerie silence. The crowd had gathered into a clump, packed together on the dry sand above the tide's reach, blankly watching the scene unfold. They didn't attempt any form of help, not even offering a single suggestion or word of encouragement. Or perhaps they dared not. A nightmarish fear permeated the air. People subconsciously fear. The strange things that have never been revealed in the world are quietly approaching. A few minutes feel as long as several hours. One can still see the figures swaying. In the rapidly rising tide, they form a long line, twisting rhythmically into waves, slowly carrying a terrifying aura of ill fortune. Increasingly thick clouds swept over the moon. The water path, which had just been sparkling, was almost disappearing at this moment. The remaining heads on the water's surface formed a winding curve. They swayed, appearing and disappearing. Occasionally, a victim would anxiously look back. Grayish face can only leave a faint pale light in the darkness. The steps of the gathering clouds gradually quicken, and eventually, in the rift of their anger, they cast a tongue that swallows and exhales scorching flames. It was a lightning bolt. And immediately following was the rumbling thunder, growing from light to heavy. It quickly reached a deafening and maddening level. The final clap of thunder brought the spectacle to a climax. A thunderclap that shook the earth and sea, bringing a torrential downpour, washing over the entire dark world in a sweeping torrent. Heaven seemed to have opened a breach, pouring down a vengeful flood. Finally, the spectators on the shore instinctively began to move. They retreated back to the steps of their own hotel. Rumors had already spread into the ears of the hotel guests by the seaside. As a result, those who had retreated, hoping to find some comfort, were horrified to discover that the people staying in the hotel were just as panicked as they were. I think, at that time, there must have been rumors spreading that were shocking, but I can't be sure. Some people had been staying in the hotel earlier, were already so frightened that they retreated to their own rooms. As for others, they were still gazing at the victims sinking rapidly. In the intermittent flashes of lightning, the surging waves carry a row of heads. They rise and fall on the surface of the sea. I once imagined the fearful expressions on those faces. They must have their eyes wide open in anger, and inside, it reflects the fear of this malicious universe. Panic and delusion. That is the sorrow that has existed since the beginning of time, sin and suffering, and the beautiful hopes shattered and unfulfilled desires. When I look into the distance beyond those heads, I seem to see another eye. That eye so large. It seems to still burn with a firm intention, but that eye fills me with disgust. Until I quickly dispelled this unsettling vision. The unfortunate massive rescue team was gripped by an unknown claw, dragged relentlessly toward the distant deep sea. They drowned in silent prayers and screams. Once again, a catastrophic roar erupted in the angry sky. Even the earlier loud crash pales in comparison to the roar this time. Amid the raging flames pouring down, the heavenly sound mingles with the blasphemy of hell, resonating together. In the next moment, the storm ended. The rain suddenly stopped. The moon then returned to its post, casting its pale light once more. It was projected onto the quiet, eerily strange surface of the sea. We could no longer see that row of heads. The water was calm and desolate. Only the ripples in the winding path, and the swirling vortex under the moonlight, remained along with the gradually fading ripples on the outer edges. It seemed that this was exactly where that strange cry had originated. But as I held both fervent dreams and nervous reason, gazing into the distance along the treacherous, glowing path, it seemed I heard a faint, sinister laughter drifting up from the depths of that lost ocean, a weak and wicked laugh. This horror story, the couple's story, is a joint creation, The Horror of Martin Beach. This point is crucial. The original title of the work is The Invisible Monster, written by Hai Ren. It was first published in 1923. It has already been 100 years since it was published. It was featured in the November 1923 issue of Strange and Mysterious Tales. However, the works of these masters of horror published in Strange and Mysterious Tales are not limited to just these. There are more. If there's a chance in the future, you can also join me in opening Strange Tales from a Lonely Studio, a Century of Selections vault, and tell me which story you'd most like me to adapt and share with everyone. Defan is also looking forward to everyone's recommendations here. So if you want to hear stories, you've come to the right place. See you next time. Good night.